"I's the 6-star 500 a month helping you, Nana." That was the first thing my grandson said when he walked in. I froze. My mind replayed the number on a loop, 6,500 each month. For 2 years, I had never seen a single cent. Last week I stood at the pharmacy counter, sliding coins across the glass for heart pills and walking away without heating oil. I told myself I could push through one more month. Pride can be loud. Pride does not pay bills. I kept quiet because I did not want to be a burden. Graham watched my face and waited. "I send it through, Lydia," he said. His wife, the woman who breezed in with a smile, staged a photo of me holding a mug and left before the water cooled. Proof for him. A performance for me? "Graham, I have never received that money," I said. My voice cracked. He searched my eyes for a joke. "There wasn't one. 2 years?" he whispered. "That's $156,000. The number sat between us like a verdict. My stomach clenched. I thought of granite counters she had boasted about. I thought of the shiny SUV in her driveway last Christmas. Meanwhile, I wrapped myself in old quilts and counted pennies in the dark. Part of me wanted to defend her, to make sense of it. Maybe a mistake, maybe a delay, but I knew better. I knew the pattern, the short visits, the careful angles, the text to Graham with captions like, "Nana is all set." She did not mean me, she meant herself. Graham exhaled slow and heavy. "Will you help me get proof?" he asked. The question was simple, the choice was not. Silence had kept the peace and kept me hungry. Silence had protected her, not me. I looked at my hands. They have shelved books for decades. They have washed dishes, tied shoelaces, and signed checks for people I love. They can sign one more thing? "Yes," I said, "but we do it quietly." He nodded once. Quietly works. The judge in him surfaced in that tone. It steadied me. I did not need a speech about betrayal. I was living with its receipts. The final notice for oil. The past due mark on the electric bill. The cardboard box of canned soup I stretched for dinners. I had clipped coupons while someone else cashed checks with my name in the subject line. I felt anger building, but it did not roar. It settled clear and organized. I started listing steps in my head, bank statements, dates, amounts, messages, faces to remember and questions to ask. I would not be rushed. I would not be distracted by apologies sent through intermediaries. Graham sat across from me like he was preparing for trial. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need the truth on paper," I answered. "And I need you to listen when it hurts." He swallowed. "I'm listening." I told him about the choices I had made in silence. The pills over groceries. The winter nights wearing 2 sweaters. The way I told neighbors I liked it quiet so they would stop asking. I told him how Lydia called me "sweetheart," like a stage line, and how I thanked her for half a loaf because gratitude was cheaper than conflict. He pressed his palms together. "Knuckles white. I should have known," he said. Guilt tried to climb onto my shoulders, but I brushed it off. "This is not your fault," I said. "Believing a spouse is not a crime. Stealing from family is." For the first time in months, I felt something other than dread. I felt control. Not over her choices, but over mine. I would not play the helpless grandmother in her story. I would write my own. I stood slow but steady. I gathered the bills into a neat stack. I placed a blank notebook on top. "From today," I said, "we document." He nodded again. "Document everything." I met his eyes and held them. "Graham," I said, "no scenes, no shouting, no threats. We let the facts do the work." His mouth tightened. "Understood." Inside, I set a line I would not cross. No begging, no bargaining, no pretending I misheard the number to keep peace at dinner. If she wanted peace, she should have been honest. I took a breath that did not shake. I was done apologizing for needing heat, food, and respect. I was done accepting stage kindness in place of care. I was done being a convenient prop. I am not a problem to be managed. I am a person, and I am done today. If your family lied about helping you, would you confront them or stay silent? I used to think love alone could hold a family together. Back then, the winters felt warmer, even when snow piled high against the porch. Graham was just a boy running around in boots too big, laughing like the world was made only for him. I would stand at the kitchen window, dish towel in hand, feeling rich in all the ways that mattered. I remember saving every spare dollar so he could have piano lessons. We'd skip dinners out, patch old clothes, and pretend it was nothing. His hands on those keys made every sacrifice feel light. I never told him how many nights I sat by the stove, counting coins to make it happen. After Robert passed, it was Graham who carried the grocery bags for me, who insisted I sit while he shoveled the walk. He had that same earnest look as his grandfather, quiet strength, a kind of loyalty you think will never fade. I believed in that more than I believed in my own health. In those days, I baked bread every Sunday, even when my wrists ached. The smell would fill the house, and Graham would sneak the first slice before it cooled. "Don't tell your grandpa," I'd whisper, even though Robert always knew. We were a team, the three of us. Now, sitting alone in the same kitchen, the walls echo different. The table feels bigger, the silence between phone calls stretches longer, the memories push in like an old movie, one you can't stop watching even when it hurts. I think about the way Graham used to look at me. Trust in his eyes, no suspicion, no distance. It's strange how life can turn without warning. One season you're the heart of the family, the next you're an afterthought in someone else's schedule. I try to tell myself people get busy, that it's not personal, but some days that lie is harder to swallow. I catch myself glancing at the old piano in the corner. The keys are yellowing, untouched for years. I imagine Graham sitting there again, playing that simple tune he learned at 12, the one he practiced until it was perfect. Back then, he didn't have to ask if I was okay. He just knew. It's that boy I hold on to in my mind, the one who believed I could do anything, the one who made me feel I still had purpose. That memory is my anchor, even as the present tries to pull me loose. The first changes were so small I almost missed them. Lydia started answering Graham's phone when I called. Always cheerful, always with a reason why he couldn't talk just then. "He's busy, Nana. I'll let him know you called." Weeks would pass without him returning those calls. Then came the visits that weren't really visits. Lydia would pull into the drive, step inside for a quick hello, snap a photo of me at the table, and leave before I could even pour tea. She'd send the picture to Graham, and I began to understand. These were not moments for me. They were proof for him. Graham's texts grew shorter, polite but rushed. I told myself he was buried in work, that being a judge came with weight I couldn't imagine. But I could feel the thread between us thinning, and no matter how I tried to hold it, it kept slipping. One afternoon, I mentioned the oil bill to Lydia. She smiled like she was humoring a child. "Oh, don't worry about those little things. We've got it covered." The way she said "what" made my skin prickle. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think I was still part of that. But deep down, I knew better. The house felt colder that winter, and not just from the lack of heat. I stopped baking bread. The smell didn't seem to have a place here anymore. I kept the piano covered, not wanting to see the dust gather where Graham's hands once moved so freely. There were moments when I thought of asking him directly, of breaking through whatever wall had been built between us. But I held back, pride again, and fear of hearing that the distance was intentional. So I kept my words soft, my questions careful, and my days quiet. I told myself that loyalty meant patience, that love meant giving people time to come back to you. I waited, and while I waited, Lydia became the gatekeeper to my own family. Looking back now, I see it clearly. The small shifts were the foundation for something bigger, a pattern, a plan. And by the time Graham asked me about that money, the ground under us had already cracked wide open. The invitation came through Graham, but I knew it was Lydia's idea. "Just a casual dinner?" he said. "Family only." I told myself it was a chance to be included, to feel like part of the circle again. When I arrived, Lydia greeted me with a smile so polished it could have been printed. "Margaret, you made it," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. Her eyes were already scanning the room, checking who was watching. We sat at the long table, plates lined up like props. Graham poured wine, talking about a recent case. I listened, nodding, careful not to interrupt. Lydia asked the others about their vacations, their new homes, their hobbies. When her gaze landed on me, her tone shifted. "So, Margaret, how's the quiet life treating you?" she asked, tilting her head. The pause before quiet carried weight. I smiled politely. "It has its moments," I said. She laughed softly. "I bet it does. Not much to manage when you don't have responsibilities." The fork in my hand felt heavier. A cousin glanced down at his plate. Graham kept talking to the uncle beside him. I tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, asking about her work. She gave a clipped answer, then turned back to me. "It must be nice, not having to keep track of things." At a certain age, details can get tricky. Her words were sugar over steel. My first instinct was to defend myself, to remind her I had managed a library budget for decades, taught countless students how to organize and remember. But I stayed quiet. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. The clink of cutlery filled the gap. Lydia sipped her wine, eyes bright with something that wasn't kindness. I mean, Graham's such a help with, well, everything you can't do anymore. There it was. The first direct cut, wrapped in a compliment. My chest tightened. Heat rose to my face, not from embarrassment but from the effort of holding my tongue. I glanced at Graham. He didn't seem to catch the barb, or maybe he was choosing not to. I chewed slowly, every bite tasteless. The voices around me blurred, but Lydia's carried clear, like she wanted me to hear every syllable. I kept my gaze steady on my plate, fingers pressing into my napkin under the table. That was the moment I felt the first real crack in the evening. It wasn't loud, but it was deep. I knew then that this dinner was less about family and more about performance. And I had just been cast in the role of the helpless elder. I thought that was the end of it, but Lydia wasn't done. She leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine. "It's wonderful Graham has the means to support family," she said, her eyes locked on mine. "Not everyone can enjoy comfort without contributing." The room went still for me, though the others kept moving. I caught the quick glance between two cousins, the way one of them reached for bread just to have something to do. Graham shifted in his seat, but he didn't speak. Lydia smiled sweetly, as if she'd just paid me a compliment. "You've earned your rest, of course," she added, that same false warmth coating every word. "Some people don't know when to stop working, but you." She let the sentence dangle, letting the implication hang in the air. I swallowed hard. Every instinct told me to stand up and leave, to put a wall between us before she pushed further. But I stayed, because walking out would make me look exactly like the fragile figure she painted. A server brought out dessert, small slices of cake, plates clinking softly. I didn't taste mine. My focus was on the conversation flowing around me like I wasn't there. "That was the point." She wanted me sidelined irrelevant. Then, almost casually, she turned to Graham. "You're generous to a fault," she said. "It's a lot to carry, making sure everyone is taken care of." Her gaze flicked to me, then back to him, especially when some can't return the favor. The final blow landed clean. There was no misunderstanding, no way to hear it differently. Graham set his fork down, but instead of answering, he asked his uncle about fishing trips. The topic shifted, and with it, the oxygen seemed to leave the room. I finished the last sip of water, my hand steady even though my chest felt tight. I smiled when someone asked if I wanted more cake, declining with a polite shake of my head. The performance had to go both ways. If she could pretend civility, so could I. When the meal ended, people stood in small clusters saying their goodbyes. Lydia kissed the air again, telling me to drive safe, in a voice that carried no care. Graham hugged me lightly, already turning to help with coats. I stepped into the night air, cool and sharp, and let the silence settle. Every word she'd said replayed in my head, not to wound me again, but to fix them in place. I wanted the details intact. The tone, the expressions, the exact phrasing, they would matter later. As I walked to my car, I made a quiet promise. I wouldn't match her cruelty in public. I wouldn't let her see me break. But I would remember. And when the time came, I would make sure she remembered too. 3 days after that dinner, Lydia showed up at my door without calling. She carried a leather folder under her arm and wore that brisk smile I'd come to know too well. "Just some paperwork," she said, stepping inside before I could answer. "Graham's tied up in court, so I told him I'd help you sort it out." She set the folder on my kitchen table like she was claiming territory. I stayed standing. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked. "Oh, nothing complicated," she replied, flipping it open. "Just routine updates for the accounts, a few signatures so we can streamline things." Her tone was light, but the papers weren't. I saw bank logos, account numbers, language about authorized access, and primary holder. My name was printed, but not always in the right place. Some lines were blank, waiting. "I thought the accounts were fine as they are," I said. My voice was steady, but inside a slow alarm was ringing. She gave a soft laugh. "It's just easier this way. You won't have to keep track of bills or deposits. We'll handle it for you." That, again. The same one that had crept into our conversations all winter. I sat down, not to sign but to buy time. I pretended to read line by line, my eyes catching phrases. "Transfer of authority. Removal of co-signer. Why now?" I asked, looking up. "Well," she began, smoothing the edge of the page. "You've been under so much stress. We all just want what's best for you. Graham worries, you know." I thought of the oil bills, the empty pantry, the words she'd thrown at me over dessert. My fingers rested on the pen she'd placed by my hand. She was watching closely, too closely. "I'll need to have my lawyer look at this," I said finally. Her smile thinned. "That's not really necessary, is it? These are standard forms. We're family." I met her eyes. All the more reason to be careful. Hey, for a beat, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Then she closed the folder, quick and precise, tucking it back under her arm. "Well, if you insist," she said. "But don't wait too long. These things have deadlines." She left without another word, her perfume lingering in the doorway. I stood there until I heard her car pull away, my heart pounding harder than it should have. I didn't know exactly what she was trying to take, but I knew this. She wasn't going to get it without a fight. As soon as her car disappeared down the road, I pulled the old metal lockbox from the hall closet. It still smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the way it had since Robert first brought it home. Inside were my bank statements, stacked by month, the edges worn from years of handling. I spread them out on the table, the same spot where Lydia had tried to make me sign. The numbers told a story, and it wasn't mine. Withdrawals in neat round amounts. Farge 500 here, 2,000 there on dates I couldn't place. My heart thudded as I ran my finger down the columns. Some entries were marked as authorized by secondary holder. I didn't have a secondary holder. I reached for the phone before I could talk myself out of it. The automated voice at the bank seemed to drag on forever before a clerk picked up. "This is Margaret Lowell," I said. "I need to review some recent transactions." The clerk was polite, efficient. Too efficient. "Yes, Mrs. Lowell, I see the withdrawals. They were processed through a joint authorization linked to your account?" "I don't have a joint authorization," I said. There was a pause. "It's listed under a Lydia Harper, relationship family." I gripped the receiver so tightly my knuckles ached. "How long has that been in place?" "According to our records, about 22 months, nearly 2 years. 2 years of believing I was just scraping by. 2 years of choosing between medicine and heating oil while someone else used my name to drain the account. Can you send me every record you have?" My voice was flat now, a calm I didn't feel. "Yes, Mrs. Lowell. We can overnight the statements and the authorization form on file." When I hung up, the silence in the house pressed in on me. I looked at the piano in the corner, the keys half covered by the old sheet. I thought of Graham, still unaware, sending money he believed was helping me. I thought of Lydia, standing in this kitchen, smiling as she slid that pen toward me. I gathered the statements into a manila envelope, added my own notes in the margins, and locked it all back in the box. The metal clicked shut with a weight that felt final. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the truth, and about every quiet slight she thought would go unnoticed. She had been building her case against me in whispers and staged photos. Now I was building mine against her, in ink and paper. I slid the lockbox under my bed before turning out the light. Sleep wouldn't come easily tonight, but that was fine. I wasn't planning to rest. Not yet. The call's friend stopped first. At least that's how it felt. One week, I was talking to Ruth about the spring fair. The next, silence. I left messages, but no one called back. Then I saw her, Ruth, at the grocery store. She looked surprised, almost guilty. "I tried to visit," she said quickly, "but Lydia told me you weren't feeling up to company." My chest tightened. "She said that?" Ruth nodded, eyes darting toward the exit. "She made it sound like you needed rest." I didn't want to intrude. It was the same with the church group. Invitations stopped coming. When I asked about the book club, someone muttered that they'd assumed I wasn't interested anymore. I started to notice the pattern. Lydia's words had spread further than I'd imagined. I wasn't just being left out. I was being rewritten. Graham still called, though less often. Always from the office, never from home. "How are you, Nana?" he'd ask, his voice warm but hurried. "I'm fine." I'd say, though, I wanted to tell him everything. But with Lydia possibly just out of frame, listening, I chose caution over confrontation. Even the neighbors began keeping their distance. Mrs. Turner, who once brought me fresh bread every Saturday, now waved from her porch instead of stopping by. The smile she gave me was tight, polite. The walls of the house seemed to draw closer. Days stretched in quiet loops. Tea, the newspaper, the creak of the floorboards when I moved from one room to the next. I found myself listening for the phone, willing it to ring, knowing it likely wouldn't. One afternoon, I tried calling Graham directly. The call went to voicemail. An hour later, Lydia sent a text. "He's busy today. I'll tell him you called." The words were simple, but the message beneath them was not. She wanted me to know she was in control, that my voice had to pass through her before it reached him. I began keeping a journal, not of feelings, those were too raw, but of facts. Dates, times, names. Who said what? Who didn't call? Each page felt like a small reclaiming of truth, a way to counter the version of me Lydia was selling to the world. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. This wasn't neglect by accident. It was a strategy, and like any strategy, it could be dismantled if you had the patience to watch it play out. Winter deepened, and so did the silence. Days passed when my phone didn't ring at all. Even the junk mail seemed lighter, as if the world had agreed to forget I lived here. Once I walked down to the post office, hoping for a letter from an old friend. The clerk handed me a single envelope, an insurance ad, and looked at me with that careful politeness reserved for people you're not sure how to speak to anymore. At the grocery store, I overheard two women from church talking about a community dinner. When I approached, their smiles froze. "Oh, we didn't think you'd be interested," one said. "Lydia mentioned you were keeping to yourself." Keeping to myself. The phrase landed like a verdict. Even Graham's calls had changed. He still asked about my health, but there was always a hesitation, like he was checking boxes. I imagined Lydia standing just out of sight, ready to step in if my answers strayed from the script. "Everything's fine." I'd say, keeping my voice light. It wasn't a lie exactly, just not the truth he needed to hear. I began moving differently in my own house, as if Lydia might appear at any moment. I kept the lockbox hidden. I started memorizing account numbers just in case. The only real connection I had left came unexpectedly. Emily, a neighbor's granddaughter who sometimes helped with errands, knocked on my door one icy afternoon. "Mom says I can bring you groceries if you need," she said, cheeks pink from the cold. Her visit was brief, but it reminded me that not every door had closed. I paid her in cash, slipping a little extra into the bag for her trouble. When she left, I stood at the window watching her cross the street, the small figure in a bright red coat. I realized then that Lydia's net wasn't perfect. She could tighten the circle, but she couldn't seal it completely. There would always be threads she didn't see, or didn't value enough to cut. At night, I read through my journal entries, tracing the lines between each act of isolation. The picture forming was clear, deliberate, and ugly. But it also gave me something I hadn't felt in weeks: focus. I wouldn't confront her yet. That would give her a chance to twist the narrative again. No, I would let her believe she had succeeded. Let her think the walls she'd built were unbreakable. In the meantime, I would keep listening, keep writing. And when the moment came, I would have more than feelings on my side. I would have proof. The invitation came in a group text. A family gathering, Lydia wrote, to celebrate Graham's latest appointment. The tone was warm, almost generous. It was the first time in months my name had been included in any family plan. I stared at the screen, debating. Every instinct told me to decline, but something in the careful wording made me curious. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a stage. When I arrived at the rented hall, the air hummed with conversation. Round tables dressed in white linens, trays of hors d'oeuvres, the clink of glasses. People milled about in their best clothes, greeting each other with easy laughter. Lydia spotted me from across the room. Her smile was broad, polished, but her eyes didn't warm. "Margaret, you made it?" she said, kissing the air near my cheek. "I was worried you might not feel up to it." I kept my voice steady. "Wouldn't miss it." She guided me toward a table near the front, in full view of the crowd. Graham was across the room, surrounded by colleagues, his expression bright and unguarded. I felt a pang he had no idea. As the evening unfolded, Lydia worked the room effortlessly. Every so often, her gaze would flick to me, as if checking a mark on a list. She introduced me to people I'd never met, always with the same line. "This is Margaret, Graham's grandmother. She's been keeping a quiet life." The pause before quiet landed like a tap on a bruise. I smiled through it, answering politely, making small talk where I could. Midway through the night, she approached with a glass of champagne. "We're about to start the speeches," she said, "and we'd love for you to sit up front. Family first, of course." I moved to the seat she indicated, directly in front of the small stage. The lighting made it impossible to see the crowd clearly, but I could feel their attention settle. Graham was still across the room, shaking hands, unaware. Lydia took the microphone, her voice smooth. She spoke of Graham's achievements, his dedication, his generosity. The room applauded, and he stepped forward, smiling, to take his place beside her. Then her tone shifted. "Family support is everything," she said. "We all have someone who depends on us, someone we help along the way." Her eyes found me. She didn't name me, but she didn't need to. It's important to care for those who can't quite manage on their own anymore. We make sacrifices, but that's what family does. A few heads turned toward me. The words wrapped in sentiment, but sharp underneath. I felt the weight of every glance, the quiet murmur at the edges of the room. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, my heart beat a steady drum in my ears. This was no casual remark. This was her theater, and I was the scene she wanted to play. What she didn't know was that I was watching too, every word, every shift in the crowd, every look exchanged. If this was her move, I would remember it, and I would choose my own moment to answer. Lydia's voice carried over the crowd, warm enough to fool anyone who didn't know better. "Some of us," she said, "give without expecting anything in return. We pay bills, arrange doctor visits, even take on responsibilities others can't handle anymore." A ripple moved through the room. Some nodded in approval, others glanced at me, their expressions unreadable. I kept my face still, but inside my chest tightened. She gestured toward me with a gracious sweep of her hand. "We don't do it for recognition, but tonight I think it's worth acknowledging the care we give. Graham and I have done everything possible to ensure our loved ones live in comfort." The words landed like stones. Comfort. As if the cold months, the skipped prescriptions, the empty pantry were comfort. I saw Graham's head turn sharply toward her, his brows knit, the easy smile gone. He stepped closer, but she kept speaking, keeping him just out of the moment. People began to murmur. The air felt heavier, like the pressure before a storm. Lydia's tone softened, almost tender. "It's not always easy, caring for someone who can't manage on their own. But we do it because we're family." That was the kill shot. The framing was perfect, public enough to seem generous, private enough to wound where no one else could see the bruise. I let the silence hang, then gave a small nod as though I agreed. Let them think I accepted the role she'd written for me. Let her believe I was too timid to push back. What she didn't notice, what no one noticed, was the small recorder in my jacket pocket. It had been running since the first speech began, capturing every word, every pause, every patronizing inflection. Graham finally made it to my side. "Nana," he said quietly, "are you okay?" "I'm fine," I answered, meeting his eyes. It wasn't a lie. Not anymore. The rest of the evening blurred: applause, toasts, polite laughter. I played my part, thanking people for their kind words, accepting hugs from those who believed them. When it was over, I walked out into the night air. The recorder was still warm in my pocket. I pressed my hand against it, feeling the weight of the proof I now had. This was more than humiliation, it was evidence, and evidence in the right hands was power. As I drove home, I thought about how many times people like me are written out of their own stories, replaced with a version that suits someone else's agenda. I wasn't going to let that happen again. If you were in my place, sitting under the lights, listening to someone rewrite your life in front of a room full of witnesses, what would you do next? The morning after the party, I didn't bother with breakfast. The recorder sat on the table beside my tea, its small red light now dark. I'd listened to the playback twice already, each word sharper than it had been in the moment. But words weren't enough. Not yet. I went to the bedroom closet and pulled down the old sitter box from the top shelf. Inside were file folders, some dating back to when Robert was alive. Bank statements, insurance papers, property deeds, all the things we'd promised to keep safe. The first folder was just as I remembered, the second too. But the third stopped me cold. A stack of account forms I didn't recognize, dated months after Robert's death. My name was there, but the signature wasn't mine. I traced the pen strokes with my finger. Too heavy in places, too rushed in others. Whoever had done this knew my name, but not my hand. I turned the page and found another document. An update to a joint account. The secondary holder was listed as Lydia Harper. The authorization date was almost exactly when the bank clerk had said the joint access began. The paper smelled faintly of the lemon polish Lydia used in her kitchen. My stomach tightened. I spread the documents across the bed, scanning for patterns. Dates aligned with the withdrawals I'd noted in my journal. Large sums removed just before oil deliveries or medical appointments. Times when I was too distracted to notice a missing balance. The deeper I looked, the more deliberate it felt. Each change in the paperwork, each signature line, was part of a design. I picked up the phone and called the bank again. "I need copies of all authorization requests tied to my accounts," I said. My voice was calm, but my fingers gripped the receiver until they ached. The clerk hesitated. "That may take some time. I'll wait." When I hung up, I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making a timeline. On the left, my life, the real one. On the right, the version Lydia had been building. The gap between them was the space where my freedom had been shrinking. Midway through the afternoon, I found a small envelope at the bottom of the box. Inside was a letter from the bank manager, dated nearly 2 years ago, confirming changes, as requested. The letter was addressed to me, but I'd never seen it. The return address was right, but the postmark was from a neighboring town. My eyes narrowed. Someone had intercepted it, opened it, and resealed it before I could read it. I set the letter down carefully, as though it might break. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was theft, and now I had something that connected the withdrawals to her hand, not just her word. I gathered the documents, slid them into a fresh folder, and tucked it into the bottom drawer of my desk. The lock clicked into place. Lydia thought she'd built her case in secret, but she'd left fingerprints everywhere. All I had to do was follow them. That night, sleep refused me. I lay in bed staring at the faint glow of the streetlight leaking through the curtains. The envelope from the bank sat on the nightstand, its presence louder than any sound in the room. I reached over and touched it, running my fingers along the sealed edge. The paper was cool, almost slick, proof, the kind that couldn't be brushed aside with sweet words or false concern. Robert's voice came back to me, clearer than it had in years. "Never let anyone write your story for you, Maggie. Not while you can still hold a pen." He'd said it the night we signed the deed for this house. We were younger then, our hands stained with paint from fixing the porch. Back when every decision felt like it belonged to us. I turned onto my side, pulling the blanket tighter. Images from the past months shuffled through my mind, the closed doors, the unanswered calls, Lydia's practiced smile in that rented hall. Every slight had a place on the timeline now, each one leading me here. My eyes flicked to the dresser where my journal lay. I got up, patted across the floor, and opened it to a fresh page. The pen felt heavy, but steady. I wrote down the day's events in short, clipped sentences, like entries in a ledger. Bank visit. Carver confirmed forgery. Copies secured. The act of writing made my thoughts sharper. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was preparation. Every note I kept, every scrap of paper I saved, was a brick in something I was building. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold. The clock ticked in the hallway. Outside, a neighbor's car door slammed, then quiet again. The stillness let me hear my own resolve. If I moved too soon, she'd twist it, make me the unreasonable one. But if I waited too long, she'd take more. The balance was delicate. I thought about Graham, about the look on his face at the party when her words finally cut through. He was my only link inside her world. If I played this right, he could be more than that. I closed the journal, slid it into the bottom drawer, and locked it. Then I went back to bed, the envelope still on the nightstand. My eyes stayed open until the first hint of dawn crept across the ceiling. When I finally slept, it wasn't peace that found me. It was focus, and focus was exactly what I needed. I woke before the alarm, though I hadn't set one. The light through the curtains was pale, brittle, the kind that doesn't warm a room. The envelope still sat on the nightstand. I picked it up, slipped it into my tote, and dressed in layers. Wool sweater, heavy coat? My reflection in the mirror looked older than yesterday, but sharper somehow. At the kitchen table, I opened my journal again. The list from last night stared back at me. I added 3 new lines. Call attorney. Check insurance policy. Confirm property tax records. Each was a step she didn't need to know about. I started with the phone calls. The attorney's assistant scheduled me for next Tuesday at 9. The insurance rep confirmed my coverage hadn't changed, though someone had requested an update form last spring. I asked for a copy. By noon, I was at the county clerk's office. The woman behind the desk slid the property file toward me. "Everything's current," she said, then paused. "Though there was an inquiry 6 months ago about transferring partial ownership." My hand tightened around the pen I'd been holding. "Was it filed?" She shook her head. "No, just an inquiry." Back home, I moved through the house like I was seeing it for the first time. Each drawer, each cabinet held something I might need. Birth certificate, tax returns, even Robert's old work ID. I made a second set of copies, storing them in a weathered tin box under the floorboard in the spare room. In the afternoon, Lydia called. Just checking in, she said. Her voice was bright casual. How are you feeling? Better, I told her. Getting some rest. I let her talk about Graham's schedule, the errands she was juggling. I kept my own words few, my tone even. She didn't need to hear the movement beneath the surface. When the call ended, I jotted down the time and date in the margin of my journal. Even her smallest conversations went into the record now. As dusk settled, I walked to the end of the street and mailed 2 envelopes, one to the attorney, one to an old friend I trusted with more than most. Each carried pieces of the story, fragments of proof. If anything happened, they'd know. Back inside, I made tea and sat in the dim kitchen. The quiet wasn't heavy tonight. It was useful. It let me hear the gears turning, the plan shaping itself. Lydia thought the game was still hers. She hadn't noticed that I'd stopped reacting, that I'd started recording, copying, locking away. And by the time she did, it would be far too late. I started with the smallest leak. At the bank, I requested a change of address for all statements. From now on, send them to my P.O. box. I told the clerk. She didn't ask why, just tapped her keyboard and smiled. That alone would keep Lydia from intercepting anything new. Next, I called the utility companies. Paperless billing, I said. Email only. I gave them my own address, an account Lydia didn't know existed. She'd lose one more way to monitor me. The moves were small, almost invisible from the outside. That was the point. If she noticed too soon, the whole thing could collapse. At home, I pulled out the receipts I'd been saving for months. Grocery runs, oil deliveries, medical bills. I sorted them into folders, marking each with a colored tab. Green for necessary expenses. Red for things Lydia had claimed she'd paid. The red pile was growing. In the evenings, I met with Ruth from across the street. Over tea at her kitchen table, we went over what she'd seen. Times Lydia came by when I wasn't home, packages left at the door, letters taken from the mailbox. Ruth's memory was sharp, her notes better than mine. You'll need witnesses, she said, handing me a small spiral notebook. Dates, times, descriptions, it all counts. The following week, I visited the credit union where Robert and I had kept a small savings account. I hadn't touched it in years, but the balance was still there. I transferred the funds to a new account under my name only, at a different branch entirely. Walking out, I felt lighter. Not safe yet, but less exposed. At night, I spread the documents across the dining table, cross-referencing them with my journal. Patterns began to emerge. Withdrawals timed to coincide with my hospital visits, deposits that never reached my account, bills paid twice. The recorder stayed on my desk, always ready. Anytime Lydia called or stopped by, I pressed the button before answering. I didn't bait her, I just let her talk. Sooner or later, people like her reveal more than they mean to. One rainy afternoon, I stood by the front window watching cars splash past. Lydia's SUV slowed as it passed my house, then kept going. I wondered if she was checking to see if I was home. If she suspected anything, she hid it well. I wasn't hiding, not exactly, but I was no longer the woman waiting for her next move. I was making my own. Every change I made was a brick in the wall between us. Quiet, deliberate, and built to hold. The final cut came on a Tuesday. I sat across from the bank's compliance officer, a calm man with silver hair and a precise way of speaking. Remove all secondary access, I said. Effective immediately. He scanned the file, then typed a note into his computer. Don't, he said. Only your signature will be recognized from now on. Walking out, I passed the customer service counter. Lydia's name was still on one of the account alerts, printed in small black type. In an hour, it would be gone. That night, I moved through the house with a quiet purpose. Passwords changed, locks checked. The tin box of documents shifted to a safer spot, one even I had to think twice to find. By midweek, the ripple reached her. She called at 8017. Margaret? She began too brightly. There's been some sort of mix-up. The card linked to your account isn't working. I let a pause hang. I'm sure you'll figure it out, I said evenly. Her voice sharpened. I was just trying to pay the pharmacy. That's odd, I replied. I paid that bill myself yesterday. Silence. Then a clip. We'll talk later. Before the line went dead. Later came sooner than she thought. That afternoon, she pulled into my driveway without calling ahead. I met her at the door. I'm busy, I told her. The recorder in my pocket caught every word. Her eyes searched mine, looking for a crack. I kept my expression neutral, my stance steady. She stepped back, muttered something about checking on Graham, and left. When her car disappeared down the street, I closed the door and leaned against it. The shift had happened. She knew the ground under her feet wasn't solid anymore. That evening, I met Ruth again. We went over the timeline. The bank changes the call. She's on the back foot now, Ruth said. Don't give her an inch. I nodded. I won't. Before bed, I opened my journal and wrote one sentence under today's date. The door is closing. I thought about how many people never get to this point, never get the chance to turn the lock themselves. And I thought about what I'd say if I could sit with someone in the middle of it, someone feeling as cornered as I once did. If you were standing at that door, with the power to shut it for good, would you hesitate? Or would you turn the key? I called Graham on a Thursday morning. My voice was steady, but I felt the weight of every word. I need you to come over. Alone. He arrived less than an hour later, his coat still damp from the rain. I didn't offer tea. Instead, I set the tin box on the kitchen table and slid it toward him. What's this? He asked. Everything, I said. Bank statements, letters, copies of every forged signature. He flipped through the folders slowly at first, then faster. His jaw tightened. She told me you were confused. That you'd signed these but didn't remember? I met his eyes. Do I look confused to you? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed the papers back into the folder and sat back in his chair. We can't let this go. We won't, I said. The plan formed quickly. Graham would arrange a meeting with Lydia at the law office he used for estate cases. Neutral ground, professional walls, every word recorded, every document laid out in sequence. I watched him make the call. His voice was calm, clipped. Lydia, we need to meet. It's about Nana's accounts. A pause. Tomorrow at 10. When he hung up, I saw a flicker of something in his face. Relief mixed with dread. She agreed, he said. Sounded annoyed? She'll be more than annoyed, I murmured. We went over the evidence again, page by page, until the order felt like a rhythm. Forged authorization, withdrawals, the letter she intercepted. It wasn't just a list, it was a story, one she wouldn't be able to rewrite. By the time Graham left, the rain had stopped. The light through the window had that brittle clarity that comes after a storm. I sat at the table alone, the tin box still open, the documents fanned out like a hand of cards. Tomorrow they wouldn't just be mine. They'd be hers to face. The law office was on the third floor of an old brick building downtown. High ceilings, heavy doors, the kind of place where voices carried but nothing felt rushed. Graham met me at the entrance. His suit was pressed, his expression unreadable. Ready? He asked. As I'll ever be, I said. Inside, the receptionist led us to a long conference room. A polished oak table stretched between two windows, the blinds half closed against the late morning glare. At one end sat Mr. Danner, Graham's attorney, broad-shouldered, with a voice that seemed built for courtrooms. Lydia arrived 5 minutes late, clicking across the floor in heels. She glanced at me, offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and took the seat opposite mine. Let's get started, Mr. Danner said, folding his hands. We're here to clarify certain matters regarding Mrs. Lowell's financial accounts. Lydia laughed softly. Of course, I'm happy to help clear up any confusion. I slid the first folder across the table. Bank statements, marked in red where funds had been withdrawn without my knowledge. Her eyes flicked over the pages, then up to me. I told you, Graham, she's been forgetting things. Mr. Danner's voice cut in. We'll let the documents speak. He opened the next folder, forged authorization forms. My signature, crooked, deliberate, side by side with the smooth. Perfect imitation. This was filed 2 years ago, he said. Mrs. Lowell, can you confirm this is not your signature? I can, I answered. Lydia shifted in her seat. Maybe you just... No, I said. I didn't. The room felt smaller with each page turned. Graham sat still beside me, his hands clasped, eyes on his wife. Danner placed a final sheet in front of her. This is a certified copy from the bank's original file. It shows you as a secondary holder, added without primary consent. She didn't pick it up. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice tighter now. Then you'll have no problem explaining each item, he replied. I watched her jaw work, the pause before she spoke. It was the first crack in her composure, and it was enough for now. We weren't finished. Not even close, mister. Danner walked through the timeline slowly. Dates, amounts, the same pattern repeating, numbers leaving, just under the thresholds that trigger calls. Do you recognize these transfers? He asked. I manage household tasks, Lydia said. She asked me to help years ago. I asked you to carry groceries, I said. Not my name. Silence tightened. His gaze stayed on the tabletop. I studied the ink of my forged signature. The loops were prettier than mine. It felt like opening a closet and finding my coat on a stranger's shoulders. She trusted me, Lydia added, softer. I kept things organized. You kept me out, I said. There's a difference? Mr. Danner didn't raise his voice. We have the form. We have the statements. We have the bank's certification. We can proceed, but we prefer clarity first. Lydia's hand stayed flat. What do you want from me? The truth, I said, and my life back. For a beat, nobody moved. The pipes groaned in walls. Let's take 5 minutes, Mr. Danner said. Then we'll resume. Henry's face drained of color. For years, he had been the one controlling the narrative, painting me as the frail, confused old woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. Now, the bank statements, notarized letters, and witness affidavits lay in neat piles on the table. Cold, undeniable proof that every dollar I had was legally and solely mine. Rachel tried to speak, but Graham's voice cut through the room like a gavel striking wood. Stop. You've both had your say. Now, here are the facts. He slid the final page across to them, a signed declaration from the bank's head of compliance. Their signatures on forged withdrawal forms glared up at them like a spotlight they couldn't escape. I watched Henry's eyes flicker between the paper and me. In that moment, he saw me not as the vulnerable mother he could manipulate, but as a woman who had lived decades, made sacrifices, and finally decided she would not be robbed of her dignity. My heartbeat was steady now, every breath deliberate. The fear that once gripped me was gone, replaced by a clarity I wished had come sooner. Rachel stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. You can't do this, we're family. The irony almost made me laugh. Family had been the weapon they used to keep me silent, to guilt me into surrendering everything. But the papers on that table told a different story, one I had written with quiet precision. I already have, I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. And I'll sleep just fine tonight. The Graham leaned back, his eyes on me, not them. Pride, pure unspoken pride, passed between us. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about reclaiming the space in my own life, the right to decide what I kept, what I gave, and to whom. The documents ensured Henry and Rachel had no legal claim, no access, no way back into the control they once wielded. They left without another word. The sound of the door clicking shut was quieter than I expected, but it carried the weight of an entire chapter closing. I sat there for a long moment, tracing the edges of the signed declaration with my fingertips. Every line, every signature was a reminder that even the smallest steps, gathering one receipt, asking one question, making one phone call, could build into something unshakable. When Graham finally spoke, his voice was soft. You did it, Nano. No, I said, meeting his gaze. We did it. The late afternoon light shifted across the room, warming the table where the evidence still lay. My hands didn't tremble anymore. For the first time in years, I felt entirely whole, not because I had taken something back, but because I had refused to let anyone take the rest of me. The morning after the meeting, the house felt different. It wasn't quieter. Silence had been my companion for years, but lighter. The air no longer carried that invisible weight, the constant tension of knowing someone else held the keys to my life. I poured my coffee without glancing at the phone, no longer expecting a call that would bring more demands or subtle threats. The tin box still sat on the counter, its lid closed for now. I didn't need to open it. I knew every document inside by heart. They weren't just papers, they were a boundary, one I had built with care and defended with proof. Graham called around noon. She's been packing, he said without preamble. Boxes, suitcases, the works? Good, I replied. My voice surprised me. No shake, no hesitation, just finality. She didn't take it well, he added. I'm not responsible for how she takes the truth, I said, and I meant it. After we hung up, I walked through the rooms of my home. The living room still bore the dent in the armchair cushion where I used to sit during her visits, tense and small, as if shrinking could protect me. Now I stood taller, letting my fingers rest on the worn fabric without that sting of memory. The kitchen felt warmer. Even the hallway seemed to breathe. In the afternoon, I stepped out to the garden. The hydrangeas were beginning to show buds, small promises of color after the long winter. I crouched to pull a few weeds, the soil cool and damp under my fingertips. It struck me how much I had missed this, simple, unguarded moments with no one looking over my shoulder. Neighbors stopped by as they passed on their walks. Ruth lingered, handing me a jar of peach preserves. You seem lighter, she said. I am, I answered. It's amazing what happens when you get your life back. We talked for a while about nothing urgent. Weather, the spring market, A new family that had moved in down the street. It was the kind of conversation I hadn't had in years, free of subtext or suspicion. Later, I settled into my chair by the window with a book. The pages turned slowly, not because I was distracted, but because I could savor them again. The words sank in. I didn't have to read the same line 3 times, my mind elsewhere, worrying about what Lydia might do next. As the light faded, I closed the book and sat in the soft glow of the lamp. My hands rested in my lap, steady. The clock ticked in the background, marking a rhythm that finally felt like mine. This was the calm after the storm, not an ending but a clearing. And for the first time in a long time, I could imagine what might grow here. That night, I slept without waking to the creak of the hallway or the phantom echo of a voice calling my name. My dreams were quiet, no arguments, no cold looks across the table, no whispered doubts in the next room. In the morning, I made tea instead of coffee. The scent curled through the kitchen, mingling with the faint sweetness of the preserves Ruth had given me. I spread them on toast and ate slowly, as if time had loosened its grip on me. By mid-morning, I began clearing the drawers in the sideboard. It was where Lydia used to help organize my bills, her hands too quick and her eyes too sharp. I found old envelopes still sealed, letters from friends I hadn't heard from in years. Some had given up after she intercepted enough of their calls. I sat on the floor, reading each one, feeling the words pull me back to places she couldn't reach. I wrote back to 2 of them right away. Just a simple note. I've missed you. I'd like to see you soon. My handwriting was slower now, but steady. It felt like reclaiming more than just correspondence. It felt like reclaiming my place in other people's lives. In the afternoon, Graham stopped by. He stood in the doorway, looking less like the cautious grandson I'd known these past years, and more like a man who understood his role in my recovery. "How are you holding up?" he asked.
"I'm not holding up,"
I said. "I'm moving forward." He smiled, and for a moment the years between us shrank. We talked about practical things, changing the locks, finalizing paperwork with the bank, closing accounts Lydia had accessed. But underneath it all was a new rhythm between us: respect, trust, the ease of knowing we'd faced the worst together. After he left, I walked to the back of the house and opened the windows wide. The air was crisp, carrying the faint sound of children playing down the street. I let it fill the rooms, sweeping out the stale heaviness that had lived here too long. As evening fell, I took out my knitting, a scarf I had started years ago and abandoned halfway. The yarn was a deep blue, soft and forgiving in my hands. I worked row after row, the motion settling my thoughts. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. When I finally set the scarf aside, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of being watched, but the peace of being alone on my own terms. I turned off the lamp and stood for a moment, looking out at the darkened street. Somewhere in that stillness, I realized I was ready. Not just to close the door on the past, but to open the next one. The storm had passed, and I was still here. The lake was still that morning, a mirror catching the pale light of early spring. My new cottage sat just beyond the birch trees, its porch facing the water. I had signed the lease 2 weeks earlier, but it already felt more like home than the house where I had spent the last decade under someone else's shadow. The first box I unpacked was filled with books, not ledgers or statements or folders marked urgent, but novels I had meant to reread, poetry collections I had carried since my 20s, a stack of children's stories for no one in particular, yet I lined them along the shelves in the small front room, their spines forming a quiet promise. By mid-morning, I walked down to the water's edge. The air was cool and the damp earth gave slightly under my shoes. I stood there letting the wind brush against my face. No one was watching. No one was measuring how I spent my hours. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of fresh paint and cedar. I set a kettle on the stove, then opened the second box. This one held photographs, see? Graham as a boy in rain boots, my late husband holding up a string of fish, snapshots of friends whose laughter I could almost hear. I pinned a few to the corkboard by the desk, arranging them so that every glance would remind me of the life I had built and kept. In the afternoon, I walked into the small town center and found the library. Its front windows looked out over Main Street, and the bell above the door rang softly when I stepped inside. I spoke with the librarian about hosting a weekly reading circle, just informal gatherings for children and anyone who wanted to listen. She smiled, handed me a sign-up sheet, and said, "We've been needing something like this." Back at the cottage, I brewed a pot of tea and sat on the porch. The lake shifted under the changing light, rippling with a kind of quiet energy. I thought about all the months I had spent surviving, about how the fight for dignity had taken so much of me, and how somehow I still had enough left to start again. This was more than a fresh start. It was a reclaiming. By the second week, the front room of the cottage had transformed. The shelves were full, a rug lay warm beneath the old oak table, and the corkboard was crowded with small flyers announcing Saturday Story R. I had written the words in thick black marker, my handwriting looping with purpose. The first Saturday, only 4 children came, shy at first, their parents lingering at the door. I read slowly, letting each page turn like the pause between waves. By the second story, they were leaning forward, eyes bright, their laughter spilling into the room. When they left, one of the mothers squeezed my hand and said, "Thank you. They needed this." I knew then.
I did too.
Graham visited that afternoon. He stood in the doorway, taking in the shelves, the chairs pulled close together, the light pouring in.
"It suits you,"
he said.
"It's mine,"
I replied. Simple but full, we sat on the porch with mugs of tea, watching the lake shift under a steady breeze. For a while, we didn't talk. There was no need. The quiet between us felt like an old quilt, soft, worn, and warm. Later, as evening settled, I walked down to the water. The sky was streaked with gold and rose, mirrored perfectly on the surface. I thought about the years behind me, the small betrayals, the long silences, the way my own voice had once felt like a fragile thing I needed permission to use. And I thought about now, standing here with no permission needed. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the far shore. I closed my eyes and breathed it in, steady and deep. The fight was over. The life ahead was mine to shape. Back inside, I wrote in my journal, "For dignity isn't given, it's kept." I left the page open on the desk, not as a reminder to myself, but as something for anyone who might one day leaf through these pages. A note from a woman who had been underestimated, and who chose, finally, to write her own ending. When I turned out the lights, the cottage glowed faintly from the street, a small beacon by the lake. Tomorrow there would be more books to sort, more stories to share, more mornings to wake without fear. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was living. And that, I decided, was the legacy worth leaving.